Now, you alluded to the effect on charities, so Curtis, over to you to hear how it's affected CRUK.
Hello, everyone. It's really good to be here with you all. It's great to see so many people online, despite the fact that we've got really amazing weather. Some would argue too hot, but it's great that you've all joined the discussion today. So I will just share my screen. Right, so I am going to take a slightly different track, just talking about Cancer Research UK. So I'm a program manager at Cancer Research UK, and there are various streams of funding at CRUK, and the one that I'm focusing on, or the one that I work in, the team that I work in, is the Centres and Institutes team. So we focus on infrastructure funding in particular. So for those of you who don't know about Cancer Research UK, I thought I'd just run through a few facts and figures later on. In case you didn't know, we're the largest fundraising medical charity in the world, largest charity funder of Cancer Research UK, although not necessarily the largest organisation. I think that title goes to the NCI in the States. We have made loads of progress in terms of helping to improve cancer survival in breast cancer, proving the link between tobacco and cancer, and the money that we do raise goes towards many other things as related to research, so information advocacy, public engagement, and so on. And we've played a major role in developing 8 of the world's top 10 cancer drugs. So we're talking about things like, way back in the 80s, temozolomide for brain tumors, abiraterone for prostate cancer, rituximab for leukemia, Avastin for a whole range of cancers, nivolumab for melanoma, and more recently olaparib for women with advanced ovarian cancers and specific BRCA mutations. And so our vision is that in the next 20 years, we'll see 3/4 of patients surviving for cancer for 10 or more years. So that's obviously improved from the 1970s, when 1 in 4 people were surviving for 10 or more years, right up to 2010, where it's 2 in 4. And we want to see that progress even further. We have 4 main objectives, I guess. So to prevent cancer, to detect and diagnose, to treat, and to optimize. And so these, I guess, form the 4 main pillars of our research strategy. But we're also trying to do this in various ways. So, for example, our laboratory research that's carried out in our core funding institutes, facilitating a shift in early diagnosis research. We're continuing to increase funding in hard-to-treat cancers. So when we say hard-to-treat cancers, we're specifically talking about brain, esophageal, lung, and pancreatic cancers. And optimizing, I guess we're talking about just making making treatments more specific for patients. So our stratified and precision medicine approaches. Some big numbers for you, just to put things into context. So we're supporting research in over 90 institutions, supporting more than 4,000 researchers, doctors and nurses. Every year our clinical trials recruit around 25,000 patients on average. And in 2019-20 financial year, we committed 455 million on new and ongoing research projects. So in terms of research funding at CRUK, so I probably don't want you to concentrate too much on the detail. this is really just to show you that we fund research through a whole variety of schemes, but that generally they just fall into three main pillars. So response mode funding, our core and infrastructure funding, and then our strategic initiatives, which we have to respond to the research landscape and where the clinical need is. And you can find out all about those schemes on our website, but within all of those categories, you'll probably find there's multiple funding schemes that sit within those. And then again, not so much concentration on the detail, but really just to show that in terms of people, we're supporting people at every stage of their career. So whether that be a PhD student all the way up to our more established researchers, and we have various modes of doing that, which for the topic of this talk are probably not so important right now. In terms of COVID-19, as some of you may have seen the main headlines, but I guess the big one is that, you know, we're facing 160 million reduction in income for this financial year. That's 30%, huge number. I think Steve talked about drop off in fundraising activity, mentioned the marathon. You know, these are all activities that we use to generate our income. And it's been really unfortunate that we haven't been able to run any of those activities actually, and you've seen, and that's resulted in this drop off. But maybe just to put that into context, that figure is not far off what we'd spend in clinical trials over the next 10 years. It's approximately 35% of our total research spend from last year. So when you're talking about cuts like this, you know, you can really start to see that that's why we start entering into discussions about, you know, potentially closing sites and the impact that they could have on many scientists if we're not able to support their research. So worst case scenarios, but very realistic worst case scenarios. In terms of CRUK, you may have heard recently that we're facing about a quarter reduction in our workforce of non-trading roles. Consultations have already started. It's been a very difficult couple of weeks in the office where people are finding out whether their roles are at risk, and even if their roles are not at risk, the impact that that's going to have on their roles. You know, all of these changes we're making so that we can continue to support discovery research and you know, make sure that cancer research can deliver on its objectives. But in order to do that, and because of the current situation, very difficult decisions have to be made. So there was a £44 million cut to research that was announced in April, I guess midway through or maybe that was around the peak of the pandemic. But we have further potential cuts, which will take our planned research spend from 400 million to 250 million over the next 4 to 5 years. So a significant cut. You know, and these cuts come at a time when the organisation was doing really well in terms of funding some really important strategic initiatives that span the cancer research landscape. And I guess some more specifics about the research budget. We've cut our response mode funding by 5 to 10%. So when I say response mode funding, for those of you that don't know, I'm talking about those big programmatic awards that can be, you know, several million for 5 years that are awarded to individuals or scientific collaborative groups, our centres and wider infrastructure. So our centres of excellence have been cut by up to 20%, so quite significant cuts. Further cuts are still to be confirmed, but we are expecting cuts right across the research portfolio. And even if there aren't cuts, such as the nature of the way that we fund research, that everything is really quite heavily intertwined. And so, you know, even if there are programs and projects that aren't cut, they will feel the full impact, and not just from CRUK, that goes to other organisations, charitable or otherwise. So the impacts that we've been finding, we've been talking to our key stakeholders. I should say actually that what's not on here is or what's not reflected is the fact that many of our research workforce actually have been seconded to the front line, our clinical staff. They have been involved in the lighthouse hubs that Steve mentioned for diagnostics and so on. So while they have paused their cancer research activities, whether that's clinical or basic research, they have been continuing on with the fight against COVID. And I think we do still have some people who are involved in those activities, if not full time. But in terms of the wider impact, we're talking about recruitment freezes, scrapping vacant posts. So these will be posts for things like specialist posts, specialist technical posts that run core facilities, project managers, program managers, even research nurse time. Some contracts will likely not be renewed. Our locations are thinking about how to prioritize ongoing activities to account for the reduction in income that they're facing. Lots of development funds. So the development funds are relatively small pots of money to the main award that our locations, our centers will use to pump prime small projects. And these small projects will give interesting findings that our researchers can then use to apply for much larger awards. And many of our locations are telling us that those are the kinds of funds that they're having to scrap in order to account for the shortfall in funding that they're facing. Quite critical actually are the extensions for penultimate year and final year PhD students. And so this has been quite difficult because obviously PhD students have a defined endpoint. Many of them have had to stop their studies. Many of them have to finish at specific times, especially if they're clinical students. And so we're thinking about how to support them. Unfortunately, CRUK is not in a position where we can fund people with costed extensions. And so we're having discussions with locations on how they can support them, if not through the university or other means. But again, that's quite difficult. And that's creating a lot of anxiety for our PhD students, but not just our PhD students, postdocs and fellows and so on, who also have deadlines that they have to adhere to. And so there's a lot of uncertainty for them, and then there's uncertainty for future research strategies of our locations. If we're cutting their funding, they're now having to think about what do they prioritize. You know, if they have to cut aspects of their strategy down, how do they still deliver, and how do they still make an impact? So again, those discussions are ongoing. And then I think this is really a long-term thing, but potential damage to reputations being world leading research institutions, quite important. So I think the UK has always been really good at kind of punching above its weight, producing really good science, really good discoveries, and so on. But we're talking about really massive reductions to funding. And I guess we just don't really know what the long-term effects of that is going to be, what the trickle-down effect will be. Will people from outside of the UK still see the UK as a world-leading cancer research location? Will early career researchers still want to come here from outside of the UK? Will people who are going to university and doing PhDs and beyond still feel like this is a viable career where they can access funding and so on? And that's already been a concern even before coronavirus. So, you know, lots of unknowns there, but there are lots of things that we do need to think about. CRUK is part of the Life Sciences Charity Partnership, so developed by the AMRC, and it's supported by many charities. And so what we're trying to do really is to force the government's hand, if you like, to provide £310 million, which would be match funded by all the charities that are part of this partnership for at least 3 years, and hopefully this could bridge the projected gap that we're going to see in funding. And so I know many of you will have heard about the 750 million package that has been provided to charities, but the key thing there is that that money is really for frontline service charities, and research charities don't really fall into this category, and so many of them are missing out on vital support from the government. So, you know, we're asking the government to support us, not to bail us out, but to support us. And I've not heard any developments, but we're still hoping. I thought I'd just give you a bit of information about how we're doing at CRUK in terms of how we work. So yeah, I guess everybody else is the same, but we've all gone virtual. Pros and cons to that, I think probably have been more productive. I think this could probably fit in a con as well, because working days probably start earlier and finish later when you have to take out commuting. I guess a good thing is that we're embracing technology, so and then we can be more innovative. And you know, I think the technology has always been there, but we have been a bit slow to take it up just because we haven't had to. And I think this situation has really forced us to use virtual platforms. So we're mostly using Teams at CRUK, but you know, working on shared documents. You know, I mean, all of these things sound very, very basic, but when you don't have to do it, you generally don't do it. Quick decision making. That's definitely been a pro of remote working. You know, when you're having meetings, you do have to make decisions quite quickly. And actually, I think people feel much more empowered to make very quick decisions in meetings, even though the chain of command can be quite long. So you know, it's not perfect. More inclusive, which is great. Lots of people have different working patterns anyway. Their parents, their carers, they have different working patterns, and I think this is really highlighted that actually, and it's forced everybody to just be a bit more considerate of other people's time and commitments. Saving money, everything is done virtually. We've had some workshops, seminars, there'll be some conferences, all of them will be virtual. Our committee meetings will be virtual, at least in the near future, and that's going to save us a whole load of money. In terms of cons, meetings, we have lots of meetings. I think I have more meetings now than I did when I was based in the office, so that's been quite exhausting. I don't think that virtual meetings, no matter how good they are, I don't think they can ever be a substitute for face-to-face interactions. Can be isolating. You do tend to lose contact with peers that you tend to bump into at the coffee machine or in the canteen, and I think that's a real shame. So you do have to work extra hard to make links with people. Can be difficult to switch off. And what we've been finding recently, particularly around the consultations for redundancies and so on, is that this is not an ideal solution for sensitive discussions. So loads of things to think about, and I think there is a good place to end.
Great, thanks Curtis, that's super.